Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Whistling Pines. The wind had a way of whispering through the trees in the grove. A strange, eerie sound that could send a chill up anyone's spine. But to the group of friends who had trekked out to this forgotten corner of the woods, it was just another part of nature until they heard it for themselves. The plan had been simple enough. A weekend away from the noise of city life, a quiet place to hike, laugh, and drink beers under the stars. They had set up camp near a grove of towering, ancient pines, tall, thin trees with long, twisting branches. The locals spoke of the grove as a strange place, known for the unsettling whistling sound the wind made as it passed through the branches. The first night, everything seemed normal. They joked around the campfire, the crackle of flames filling the air, and the sound of the wind in the trees was a gentle background to their laughter. But as darkness deepened and the wind began to pick up, that gentle sound turned into something much more distinct, much more unnerving. It started as a low whistle, like someone calling out in the distance. Then it grew louder, clearer, like voices, familiar voices whispering just out of reach. The sound seemed to wrap around them, weaving between the trees, curling through the air and sinking into their bones. No one spoke at first. They all listened, half hoping it was just the wind, half knowing it wasn't. "What's that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know," said Tom, a laugh in his voice, though it was forced. He stood up, stepping toward the trees, squinting into the blackness beyond. "It's just the wind. You know, the pines do that." But as the wind grew stronger, the whistling became clearer. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was voices, low, drawn-out whispers, like they were coming from deep inside the trees themselves. The friends exchanged uneasy looks. A nervous tension spread through them as the whispers seemed to grow louder, swirling around the camp like an unseen presence. The air was thick with it, heavy, suffocating. Each gust of wind sent shivers down their spines, but it wasn't the cold. It was the feeling of being watched, the feeling that the trees themselves were alive, and they were waiting for something. Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as the whistling reached a crescendo. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp crack sounded from one of the trees, followed by a deep, guttural growl. The friends froze, their breath caught in their throats. "What the hell was that?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. I don't know," whispered Emma, her face pale as she looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then they saw it. The roots of the trees, once buried deep in the earth, were starting to shift, moving like serpents beneath the soil. Slowly, almost deliberately, they began to rise, twisting and riding toward the camp, pulling at the edges of their tents. The trees seemed to groan, as if waking up from a long, deep slumber. And with that groan came the whispers, growing louder and more desperate. Get out now," Tom shouted, his voice breaking with panic. But it was already too late. The roots of the trees had reached the edges of their camp, pulling at their bags, their sleeping bags, anything they had left behind. Sarah screamed as one of the roots wrapped around her ankle, dragging her toward the dark heart of the grove. "Help!" she cried out, but her voice was drowned out by the wind, by the shrieking, whistling chorus that seemed to be building to a climax. The others scrambled, trying to help her, but the trees were alive. Their roots twisted around them like hands, pulling, squeezing. And the whispers, now they weren't whispers at all. They were words. Words that came straight from the heart of the trees, echoing their worst fears. "You shouldn't have come here. You're not leaving. We've been waiting." As Sarah was dragged away, the others fought back, trying to free her, but the trees were relentless. Mark screamed as a root snaked around his neck, tightening like a vice. Emma tripped, falling into the dirt as the trees loomed closer, their dark branches reaching out, clawing at the sky. They ran. They ran as fast as they could, desperate to escape. But the trees weren't just chasing them. They were following them, twisting and growing, their roots pulling the ground apart behind them. In the distance, the faint sound of more whispers could be heard, just barely audible over the howling wind. They weren't just running from the trees anymore. They were running from the forest itself. But the forest wasn't going to let them go. It had been waiting for them, and now it was hungry. Story 2. The Hollow Creek. When Jason and Claire decided to spend their weekend camping in the deep woods, they had no idea they were about to encounter a terror beyond their understanding. They had heard of the secluded creek before. Locals referred to it as Hollow Creek because of the eerie quietness that always surrounded it. Yet, to them, it sounded like the perfect escape, a place where they could unplug from the world and reconnect with nature. They arrived early in the afternoon, setting up their tent by the water's edge. The creek, in reality, was more of a slow-moving stream, winding its way through dense trees. The water was calm, almost too calm, like a still reflection. The sun was high, and the air was crisp. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But there was an unsettling feeling that lingered in the air, something Jason couldn't quite put his finger on. The usual sounds of birds, insects, and rustling leaves were missing. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As night fell, the couple settled around a small campfire, the crackling of wood the only sound breaking the unnatural silence. They spoke softly, enjoying their time together. But then they heard something. At first it was faint, a distant giggle. Claire, trying to brush it off, said it was probably just the wind playing tricks. But Jason, with his sharp ear, caught the unmistakable sound of children's laughter, joyful and carefree, echoing from across the creek. "Do you hear that?" he asked, eyes scanning the woods around them. Claire nodded, still trying to convince herself it was nothing. "It's probably kids from another camp nearby. They must be having fun." But there were no other camps, no lights, no sounds except for the strange giggles. Curiosity tugged at them. They grabbed their flashlights and made their way toward the creek, the eerie laughter growing louder as they approached. But when they reached the water's edge, there was nothing. No children, no sign of life. Only the sound of the water, eerily still. They stood there for a moment, scanning the darkness, unsure of what to do. The laughter had stopped as suddenly as it had begun, but something else lingered, a sensation that they were being watched. Maybe we should head back to the fire, Claire suggested, but Jason was hesitant. He stood there, staring at the creek, feeling something dark, calling him from beneath the surface. The night passed without further incident, but neither of them slept well. The silence felt thicker, heavier, and the shadows seemed to creep closer to the edges of their campsite. The next morning, they tried to brush it off, attributing the events to a mix of nerves and imagination. But when night fell again, they couldn't ignore the dread creeping back in. This time, the laughter came earlier, louder, and unmistakably close. The sound of splashing followed, as if children were playing in the creek. Yet the water was still, unmoving. They had to go. They couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing their flashlights again, they returned to the creek, this time pushing deeper into the woods, following the haunting sounds. The air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of Jason's neck stood on end. The laughter sounded distorted now, more like cries than joy. When they reached the creek, the moonlight revealed something that made their stomachs turn. The water, no longer water, had transformed into something else. A thick, dark sludge filled the creek, swirling and shifting. As they looked closer, their eyes widened in horror. What had once been a gentle stream was now a macabre collection of bones. Bones of campers long lost to the woods. Broken and twisted limbs, skulls staring at them with empty eyes, ribs scattered across the dark surface. The creek was a graveyard, and it had been waiting for them. Jason, what is this? Claire's voice was barely a whisper, fear making her voice tremble. Before Jason could respond, the air grew thick. The bones in the creek began to shift, as if alive. The sound of children's laughter returned, but this time it wasn't distant. It surrounded them, echoing from every direction, growing louder and more desperate. The water, or whatever it had become, began to ripple, a force pulling at the ground beneath their feet. Jason reached for Claire's hand, pulling her away, but as he did, the ground beneath them trembled. They looked down to see the earth near the creek beginning to crack, the soil giving way to something deep beneath. From the cracks came whispers, murmurs of lost souls, beckoning them to join. And then it hit them. This was the creek's curse. It fed on those who dared to come too close. It had been waiting for new souls, children who had wandered too far, and campers who thought they were safe. Before they could make a run for it, a deep, hollow voice emerged from the creek, almost as if it were calling their names. Join us. You're one of us now. Claire screamed, and Jason pulled her back, but it was too late. The bones in the creek began to rise, the water pulling them toward the depths of the earth. The land began to twist and churn, the trees growing taller and closer, their branches reaching out to trap them. With every ounce of strength, they ran, stumbling through the woods, desperate to escape. But the laughter didn't stop. It followed them, growing closer with each step. As they reached the edge of the woods, the world outside seemed to blur, the fog rolling in thick and heavy. When they finally reached the road, breathless and shaken, the creek was silent. The woods were still again, but they both knew, deep down, that the hollow creek would never let them go. They had heard its call, and now it owned them. And someday, they would return whether they wanted to or not. Because once the creek knows your name, it never forgets. Story 3. The Campfire Shadows. The fire crackled and popped, sending small embers spiraling into the night sky. A group of 6 friends sat around it, laughing, telling stories, and basking in the warmth of the flames. It was a perfect night for camping. The air crisp with the scent of pine and the sounds of the forest alive with the usual nighttime creatures. They had trekked deep into the woods, away from cell phones and distractions, for a weekend retreat. But as the darkness deepened, something about the forest felt off. David, the self-proclaimed storyteller of the group, leaned forward, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. All right, he said, holding up a hand. I've got a good one for you guys. Ever heard of the Whispering Pines? The others shook their heads. Even Mia, who had grown up nearby, seemed intrigued. David launched into his tale. He described a small town near the edge of the forest where strange things happened. People went missing, strange sounds echoed through the trees, and the townsfolk would warn anyone who came near to stay away from the pines. But of course, some people didn't listen. They went into the woods, and they never came back. As David spoke, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees around them. It was as if the forest itself was listening. Sure, sounds like a typical ghost story, Mia said with a chuckle, pulling her hoodie tighter against her. But there was a nervous edge to her voice that none of them could ignore. Hey, come on, David said, leaning back. It's just a story. But then something strange happened. The shadows cast by the fire flickered and stretched unnaturally long. At first, it was subtle, just a trick of the light. But then, as if it had a life of its own, one of the shadows began to shift. It reached out, long and thin, moving slowly toward the edge of the group. That's weird, Tom said, squinting at the shadow. He shifted uncomfortably, but the others just laughed it off. It's just the fire, Mia said. You know how it plays tricks? But it didn't stop. The shadows kept growing longer, twisting and curling in odd shapes, as if something was trying to crawl out of them. And then, slowly, they began to move on their own. David stopped mid-sentence, his voice faltering as he saw the shadows slither like dark tendrils, crawling toward the trees. I don't like this, Mia muttered, her laughter fading. It's just the wind, right? But the wind was silent now. The forest around them seemed still, too still. Mark, trying to brush off his discomfort, stood up and stretched. You guys are acting like a bunch of kids. It's just shadows. Let's get some sleep. But as he moved, the shadows seemed to follow him, inching forward like they were attached to him, as if they had somehow learned how to mimic his every movement. His arm jerked suddenly, as though his shadow was pulling at him, and he stumbled backward. What the hell? He gasped, glancing down at his feet. The shadows, his shadow, moved with an unnatural delay, as if it was too slow to catch up, like a sick reflection in a warped mirror. It's not just the shadows, he whispered, panic rising in his voice. And that's when the realization hit. The shadows were alive. They weren't just mimicking their movements. They were feeding off them, stretching and contorting in ways that no longer seemed natural. The group tried to get up, to move away from the fire, but it was too late. The shadows stretched toward them with a mind of their own, curling around their legs, pulling them closer to the darkened woods. "Run!" Mia screamed, her voice rising in terror. But as they tried to flee, they found themselves surrounded. Every direction they turned, the shadows followed, growing larger and more defined. The trees in the distance seemed to bend and sway, as if they, too, were part of this creeping darkness. The firelight flickered, casting strange, twisted shapes onto the forest floor, but no matter how fast they ran, no matter how hard they tried to escape, the shadows kept pulling them back. Tom looked over his shoulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They're mimicking us. They're copying everything we do. As they stumbled through the woods, the shadows closed in tighter, and the dark figures that had once been mere silhouettes now seemed to have faces. Faces twisted in rage. Faces of their own deepest fears. Their movements grew erratic, as if the shadows were feeding off their fear, growing stronger the more afraid they became. "We're trapped," David whispered, his eyes wide with horror. "It's like they're alive." Suddenly Mia screamed. Her shadow had stepped out of her own, grabbing her by the wrist and yanking her toward the forest. She tried to break free, but the shadow seemed to tighten its grip, pulling her into the darkness. "No!" Mark shouted, reaching out to her, but the shadows were closing in too fast. One by one, they were dragged into the dark woods, pulled by their own fears, consumed by the very things they had once laughed at. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went quiet. The fire was reduced to embers, casting weak, trembling light on the forest floor. The shadows receded, leaving only a haunting silence behind. The next morning, the camp was empty. The fire pit still smoldered, the embers glowing faintly. But there were no signs of the group, no traces of their tents, their belongings, or even their footsteps. Only the shadows remained, long and twisted, stretching unnaturally across the ground as if waiting for the next campers to come too close to the fire. Story 4. The Forgotten Trail. Tom and Laura had been hiking for hours, their bodies sore and their water bottles nearly dry. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the dense woods around them seemed to grow darker with each passing minute. They had gotten lost earlier that day, taking what they thought was a shortcut, but now it felt like they were stuck in an endless loop of trees and overgrown underbrush. The path they had been following was no longer clear, and the map in Tom's backpack was of no help. The feeling of isolation crept in, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. "Maybe we should turn back," Laura suggested, her voice tight with unease. But Tom shook his head. "We can't. We'll never make it back before dark. Let's push ahead a little longer." As they moved deeper into the woods, something caught Laura's eye, a series of old stones, partially buried in the moss-covered earth. They were shaped like rough, square pillars, weathered by time and the elements, but still remarkably intact. "Look at that," she said, pointing to the stones. "I don't remember seeing those before." Tom's gaze followed her finger. There were 4 stones placed at even intervals along the trail. They didn't look like natural formations. Someone or something had deliberately placed them here. Maybe it's a marker, Tom said, his voice carrying a note of hope. Could be an old trail. We should follow it. It might lead us out. Reluctantly, Laura agreed. They stepped onto the path, and the woods seemed to open up before them. The trees thinned slightly, and they could see farther into the distance. The path was wide, clearly traveled at some point in the past. It was the perfect shortcut they had been hoping for. But as they continued, something odd began to happen. The stones, once lined up in a straight path, now seemed to shift. They were no longer where they had been. Laura glanced back, noticing that the stones had rearranged themselves. The one closest to them was no longer in the same spot. It had moved several feet to the left. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Those stones weren't like that before." Tom turned to look, his brow furrowed, unsure of what he was seeing. "Maybe it's just an illusion. You're tired. We both are." They pressed on, but with each step, the path seemed to grow more twisted. The stones continued to move, first subtly, then with greater intensity. They would walk past one set, then turn around to find them standing in a completely different position. The air grew heavier, as if the forest itself was breathing, and the silence between them thickened. "Something's wrong," Laura whispered. "Tom, we're not making any progress, are we?" Tom stopped. He glanced around, suddenly aware that the trees seemed to have grown taller, their trunks twisted in unnatural ways, as though they were closing in on them. The ground was soft underfoot, and the path was narrowing, twisting in directions that didn't make sense. It felt as though they were walking in circles. "We need to go back," Tom said, his voice strained. But when they turned to retrace their steps, they found that the trail behind them had disappeared. The stones they had passed earlier were nowhere to be seen. The forest was now an impenetrable wall of trees and shadows, the path completely gone. Panic set in. "This isn't right," Laura said, her heart racing. "We're lost. We're really lost." They tried shouting for help, but the sound seemed to get swallowed up by the forest, as if the woods itself was absorbing their voices. Each step they took seemed to lead them further into the labyrinth, the trees shifting, the stones reappearing in different places, their surfaces now marked with strange symbols, glyphs that neither of them recognized. Symbols that seemed to pulse, faintly glowing in the fading light. The deeper they went, the more the woods closed in around them. Every path they tried led them in a circle. The same stones, the same trees, the same endless loop. It was as if the forest had become alive, a living entity that was controlling their every move. Hours passed, or was it days? Time had no meaning here. Exhausted, hungry, and scared, they collapsed at the base of a tree, their backs pressed against the rough bark, trying to catch their breath. "Tom," Laura's voice trembled. "Do you think we'll ever get out?" He shook his head. I don't know anymore." The forest around them grew quieter, but the air felt thick with an oppressive force. The strange symbols on the stones began to shift slowly, as if they were alive, watching them. Suddenly, from behind them, a voice broke the silence. It was faint at first, then grew louder, a whisper carried by the wind. "You shouldn't have come." Laura's breath caught in her throat. Tom stood up quickly, spinning around to face the voice, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the ever-moving trees and shadows. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You shouldn't have come." And then, as if the forest itself had a heartbeat, everything went silent. They sat frozen, their eyes wide with terror, their hearts pounding. The stones had disappeared once more, the path now lost to them forever. The forest had taken them, trapped them in a loop of its own making, and they were never meant to leave. The last thing Tom saw before the darkness took him was the symbols on the stones, now carved deeply into his mind, and the shape of something moving just beyond the trees. The forest would never forget them. Story 5. The Eyes in the Woods. The night was still, almost unnervingly so, as Sarah and her friends set up their camp in the shadow of an old, thick forest. They were miles from civilization, the kind of secluded spot that promised quiet, peace, and a little escape from the noise of their daily lives. The air was cool, the trees thick with foliage, and the ground soft underfoot. It was perfect. They set up their tents in a small clearing, the kind you always find, nestled in a pocket between towering oaks and evergreens. It was a secluded spot just the way they liked it. But from the very first moment Sarah stepped into the clearing, something felt off. She couldn't explain it, but she couldn't shake the feeling either. It was as if the forest was watching them. They joked about it at first. "Hey, do you think the trees have eyes?" laughed Mark, tossing a log onto the fire. "Sure," Sarah replied with a nervous chuckle. "Maybe they're just waiting to eat us." It was a joke, but as night fell, the mood started to shift. The wind had died down, and with it, so had the normal sounds of the forest. The usual chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was all gone, replaced by an eerie silence that wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. The fire crackled as they settled in, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. But with each passing minute, Sarah's unease grew. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally far. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just the darkness playing tricks on her eyes. Then she heard it, the faintest sound, a twig snapping in the distance. She froze, staring into the forest. Her friends were too caught up in their laughter to notice, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. She glanced at Mark, who was sitting closest to the woods, his back to the darkness. "Mark," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear that?" He looked at her, then over his shoulder toward the woods. "Hear what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her flashlight toward the thicket, the beam cutting through the blackness. For a second, there was nothing. Then, in the corner of the beam, she saw it. Two glowing dots, almost too bright for the darkness around them. "Guys!" Sarah called out, her heart pounding in her chest. Her friends turned and followed her gaze, the air suddenly thick with tension. The beam of light cut through the forest again, and this time there were more, dozens, maybe hundreds of eyes gleaming from between the trees. "Is this a joke?" Mark asked, his voice tight, though there was no hint of laughter. "No way," Sarah said, her voice shaking. She tried to move the light, but the eyes were everywhere. They glared from every direction, high in the branches, low to the ground, even from the darkness beyond the trees. The more she shined the light, the more eyes appeared, their reflections growing sharper, brighter. "What the hell is going on?" Jake said, standing up, his hand gripping his flashlight like a weapon. Sarah's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of those eyes on them, the silent pressure of something watching them. And then, just as her mind started to race, the silence was broken by another sound, a rustling, far off but distinct. Then another twig snapped, and another. It wasn't just the eyes. It was the sound of movement, slow, deliberate, like something stalking them. "They're coming closer," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. A cold chill ran down Sarah's spine. She could feel the shift in the air. The eyes that had been still for so long were now closing in, and with every passing second, they were getting closer. "Do you see that?" Jake said, his flashlight trembling in his hand as he swung it around. "They're moving. They're moving toward us." There was no denying it now. The eyes weren't just watching, they were following, moving in unison, shifting position, inching closer and closer. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched as though they were alive. A scream pierced the air. Sarah whipped around to see Katie, frozen, staring wide-eyed into the woods. Her flashlight pointed toward the darkness. It trembled in her hand. They're not human." Katie's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Suddenly, there was movement from all sides. Something in the forest was drawing nearer, pushing out from the darkness. The eyes weren't just shadows. They were real. Creatures, or something worse, formed from the very forest itself. "Run!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The trees seemed to shift, their limbs closing in around them. The eyes were everywhere, a sea of glowing, unblinking orbs that moved with a hunger Sarah couldn't comprehend. The forest wasn't just watching, they were being hunted. They bolted, but the forest closed in faster, the eyes darting between the trees, following their every move. The whisper started, soft at first, then louder, a chorus of hissing voices all around them. Sarah could feel it, the weight of the forest pressing in from every side, the presence of something ancient, something hungry, something that had been waiting. And as the trees creaked and the leaves rustled, she realized with sickening clarity that they weren't just lost in the woods. They were already part of it. The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness swallowed her was the flicker of 1,000 eyes closing in. The forest had claimed them, and it would keep its watch for generations to come. Story 6. The Lost Children. It was supposed to be the perfect camping trip, the kind of weekend that would give the Johnson family memories to last a lifetime. Robert, the dad, had planned the entire trip meticulously, choosing a quiet, secluded spot in the woods near Oak Hollow, a place known for its peaceful trails and fresh air. His wife, Karen, was already unpacking the cooler when they arrived, while their 2 kids, Sam and Emily, ran ahead to explore the clearing. The first sign that something was wrong came after dinner. They had just finished making s'mores over the campfire, laughing and telling stories. The sky had darkened, and the air had turned cooler, but there was something calming about the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. That was until they heard it. A child's voice, high-pitched, desperate, calling from the woods. Help! Help us, please. Karen froze, her marshmallow suspended in midair. Robert, too, stopped roasting his hot dog, listening carefully. Sam and Emily exchanged confused glances. It was far away, further down the trail, deep in the woods, but it was unmistakable. "Do you hear that?" Karen asked, her voice thin with unease. "It's probably other campers," Robert said, trying to sound casual. Kids messing around, but something in the air felt different. The woods had grown unnervingly silent, as if holding its breath, waiting. Sam and Emily, both curious, began tugging at their parents' sleeves. "Who's that?" Sam asked, squinting toward the dark outline of trees. "Why do they need help?" "I'll check it out," Robert said, standing up. "You two stay here." He grabbed a flashlight, its beam cutting through the night like a blade. Karen protested but didn't stop him, knowing he wouldn't rest until he investigated. Robert followed the sound of the cries, each step heavier than the last. The deeper he went, the harder it was to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The woods felt dense, suffocating, like the trees themselves were closing in. He reached the spot where he thought he heard the voices, but they had stopped. Silence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. "Hello," Robert called into the dark, his voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone out there?" There was nothing, just the sound of the wind moving through the branches overhead. Robert stood there for a long moment, staring into the blackness of the trees. Then, suddenly, the voice came again, this time closer, clearer, and more desperate. "Help us, please, we're lost." Robert's heart thudded in his chest. It wasn't just one voice anymore. There were others, more children's voices, overlapping each other in a chorus of pleading. He turned around and hurried back toward the camp. When he reached the clearing, his breath caught in his throat. The kids were gone. Sam? Emily? Karen's voice cracked with panic. Robert scanned the camp in frantic circles. The fire flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on the trees around them, but his children weren't in sight. "They were just here," Karen said, her eyes wide with terror. "Where did they go?" Robert grabbed the flashlight again, but this time he was more careful. The air felt colder, and that feeling of being watched returned stronger than before. He looked around, trying to shake the growing panic in his chest. "Sam! Emily!" he shouted. "Help! Help us!" The voices came again. They were calling, and they were closer now. His children's names slipped from their lips. "Sam!" Robert cried out, his voice hoarse. "Emily, where are you?" Without a second thought, he took off into the woods, Karen close behind. The trail had disappeared in the thickening darkness, but the cries guided them, closer and closer. They moved through the dense underbrush, hearing the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, as the voices echoed all around them. "Help us, please." They were right there, just on the other side of the trees, but when Robert shone the flashlight in the direction of the sound, there was nothing but the forest. The voices grew louder, more desperate, until they seemed to come from every direction. Then all at once they stopped. Robert's heart raced in the silence that followed. His breath caught in his throat, and it was then that he saw them, his children, standing motionless in a small clearing, facing away from him. "Sam, Emily," Robert shouted, his voice breaking as he rushed forward. But when they turned, his blood turned cold. Their eyes were empty, blank, hollow sockets where there had once been bright, innocent faces. Their mouths twisted into silent screams, frozen in an eternal, wordless cry. Behind them, in the darkness of the trees, more children appeared. Hundreds of them, all with hollow eyes, their bodies thin and frail, their hands outstretched toward Robert and Karen, beckoning them closer. "They're lost," a voice whispered, though it was not the voice of his children. It was something older, something ancient. "Like us." Robert stumbled back, his chest tightening as a sickening realization crept over him. The children weren't real. They were something else, spirits, forever trapped in the woods, luring people in to join them in their endless torment. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. The trees groaned, their branches creaking like old bones, as if the forest itself was alive. The spirits of the lost children began to move toward them, their empty eyes staring into Robert and Karen's souls. The whisper grew louder. "Come, join us." The forest closed in, and Robert and Karen knew, with chilling certainty, that they would never leave. Story 7. The Flickering Lantern. The forest had always been quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the unsettling kind that leaves the air thick with silence, like something is watching, waiting. A group of 5 hikers, Adam, Sarah, Ben, Rachel, and Mark, had spent the better part of the afternoon trudging through the dense woods, looking for the perfect spot to set up camp. They weren't new to hiking. They had done this kind of trip 100 times before, but today felt different. The air seemed heavier, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Adam led the group, pushing his way through the underbrush, his boots crunching the dried leaves beneath him. That's when they saw it. Hanging from a low branch was an old lantern, its rusted metal casing dark with age. It looked out of place, as if someone had left it there as a joke, or perhaps it had been abandoned years ago. The lantern swung gently in the breeze, but its flame was absent, strangely absent, as if it had never been lit at all. What caught Adam's attention, though, was the flicker. At first, it was almost imperceptible, just a tiny, trembling flash of light. But as Adam stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. He realized the lantern was flickering as if it were trying to light itself, struggling against the dark. "Did you guys see that?" Adam asked, his voice low. Sarah squinted, her hand shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. "What's that supposed to be? There's no way a lantern could light itself, right?" "I don't know, but let's try," Adam said. He pulled out a match and struck it, the scratch of the flame loud in the eerie silence of the woods. He held it to the lantern's wick, but the flame sputtered out before it could catch. He tried again, and again. The lantern didn't even seem to care. It kept flickering, its light faint and erratic, as though it was mocking him. "Maybe it's broken," Ben said, stepping forward. "We should keep moving. We're wasting time here." But Adam wasn't ready to give up yet. He reached out to touch the lantern, its cold, rusted surface sending a shiver up his spine. As his fingers brushed the metal, the flickering light grew stronger. For a moment, it seemed almost as if the lantern was alive, pulsing, breathing with a kind of ancient rhythm. Then, just as quickly, it went dark again. "Let's go," Adam said, his voice a little shakier than before. "This place gives me the creeps." The group continued on, but as they walked deeper into the forest, something strange started to happen. Every few minutes, the lantern would appear again, always in front of them, hanging from a different tree, its light flickering weakly in the dimming forest. At first, they thought it was just a trick of the mind, some kind of optical illusion, but it kept happening. Every time they turned around, there it was again, hanging from another branch, swaying with that same unsettling flicker. "Wait," Rachel said, her voice trembling. This is impossible." Ben turned around, his breath quickening. "It wasn't there before. It's like it's following us." "I know," Mark said, looking over his shoulder. "It's not just that. It's like the trees are moving." The forest had grown darker around them. The trees, once spaced out, now seemed closer, their gnarled branches reaching toward them like twisted arms. The path ahead no longer looked familiar. The forest was swallowing them up. "What the hell is going on?" Adam said, his voice breaking. The lantern flickered again, this time brighter, its glow cutting through the thickening shadows. But it wasn't the lantern that was moving. The trees were. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the forest was shifting, bending, twisting to trap them. "No," Sarah gasped, stumbling backward. "This isn't right. We need to get out of here." But the trees had closed in on them now. The path they had followed was gone, replaced by an endless sea of dark trunks and tangled branches. The lantern swayed in front of them, its light like a lure, beckoning them deeper into the forest. And then they heard it, a low, whispering hum, rising from the ground, from the very earth itself. It was coming from all directions, surrounding them. The lantern, its flicker now frantic, began to pulse faster, its glow turning an unnatural greenish hue. "We can't go back," Ben said, panic creeping into his voice. "We have to keep moving." But the path they had taken was already gone. The forest wasn't just moving, it was alive in ways they couldn't understand. The trees, the ground, the air, they were all part of something that had been waiting for them, something older than anything they could comprehend. The lantern flickered once more, its light shining brighter, and for a fleeting moment, they saw something not human, standing in the shadows, its eyes glowing with a hunger that chilled them to the bone. The last thing they saw before the darkness swallowed them whole was the lantern, now burning brightly, hanging from a tree that wasn't there before. Story 8. The Howling Hollow. It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway. Her friends, Ben, Sarah, Mark, and Emily, had packed their tents, sleeping bags, and a few bottles of beer, hoping to escape the chaos of their everyday lives and unwind in the woods. They chose a secluded spot, nestled in the center of a forest, far from the noise of civilization. The hollow, the locals called it, a deep, dark depression in the earth, surrounded by towering trees and thick brush. It felt like a place forgotten by time. The first night went by without incident. They set up camp by a crackling fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories as the moon crept higher in the sky. The night was peaceful, the kind of quiet that only a remote forest can offer. But as the wind shifted, something felt off. At first, it was just a distant sound, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from the farthest edge of the hollow. It was faint, almost like the cry of a wolf, but the group dismissed it as the usual noises of nature. They laughed it off, each of them eager to enjoy their weekend. But the howls continued. By midnight, the noise had grown louder, more persistent. It wasn't the occasional lone wolf. It was a chorus of howls, echoing through the trees. The sound seemed to draw closer, circling the camp like a pack of predators, their cries rising and falling in rhythm with the wind. Ben stood up, squinting into the dark, his hands still clutching his beer. "Did you guys hear that? It's like something's out there." Sarah's voice trembled. "It's probably just wolves, they're common in these parts, right?" Mark, always the skeptic, snorted. "Wolves? In the middle of nowhere? No way. It's probably just some coyotes or..." He was cut off by a loud, sharp howl that seemed to pierce through the night. This time, the howl was close. Too close. Emily's eyes widened, a sense of dread crawling up her spine. That didn't sound like a coyote. The temperature dropped suddenly, an icy chill sweeping through the camp. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The howls kept coming, growing louder, more urgent, until it felt like the very ground beneath them was vibrating. "Okay, this is weird," Ben muttered, his voice thick with unease. "Let's pack up and head back to the car." But just as they started gathering their things, they saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, its shape tall and hunched. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that cut through the blackness like two burning embers. The creature was standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, watching them. Then another figure appeared beside it, then another, until there were four tall, gaunt shapes, their eyes fixed on the group. "They're not wolves," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Mark breathed. "There's something else." The creatures moved slowly, deliberately, emerging from the trees like shadows given form. Their limbs twisted and jerked unnaturally, like they were never meant to walk upright. But their eyes, those glowing eyes, were locked on the group, filled with a hunger that made their skin crawl. The air around them crackled with an unnatural cold. "Run!" Emily screamed. They scattered, each of them sprinting in different directions, their hearts pounding in their chests. But the creatures were faster. They moved with a fluid grace, closing in on them despite the darkness. The howls echoed around the hollow, not coming from the creatures themselves, but from the very trees, from the ground beneath their feet. Ben tripped on a root and fell, his hands scraping against the cold earth. He turned to look over his shoulder, and there it was, one of the creatures, only feet away, its glowing eyes boring into him like a predator sizing up its prey. Its mouth twisted into something that could have been a smile or a snarl. He couldn't tell. Before he could scramble to his feet, the creature lunged. Sarah reached the edge of the hollow and looked back. She could hear the others screaming in the distance, but the howls drowned them out. She ran faster, pushing her legs to the limit. She had to get to the car. She had to survive. But just as she reached the trees at the edge of the hollow, the ground beneath her feet gave way. Her foot caught in something dark and soft, and she screamed as she fell, dragging herself backward, trying to free her leg. But it was too late. Hands, cold, clammy hands, grabbed her ankles, pulling her back into the darkness. Her scream echoed into the night. Emily and Mark were still running, but they could hear the sounds of their friends fading, replaced by the sinister howls that surrounded them. They could feel the creatures closing in, and they knew they wouldn't make it out of the hollow alive. The trees were closing in around them, their branches twisting and contorting like twisted fingers reaching down from the sky. And then they heard it, the sound that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The sound of their own names, whispered by the wind, coming from deep within the hollow. Ben, Sarah. The creatures were closer now. Too close. Emily grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the trees. "We can't outrun them," she screamed. But Mark was already slipping into the darkness, his body limp and cold. And in the hollow, the howls kept coming, unstoppable, unyielding, like something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. The hollow had claimed them all. Story 9. The Silent Lake. John had always been the kind of person who sought peace and isolation, away from the noise of the city, away from the buzz of life. So when he saw a listing online for a remote, pristine lake tucked deep in the woods, it felt like the perfect escape. A weekend alone, surrounded by nothing but the wild, the air, and the water. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that the lake wasn't what it seemed. He arrived just as the sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The campsite was isolated, miles from the nearest road, with no one else in sight. Perfect, he thought. He unpacked his gear and set up his tent, the cool breeze of the forest calming his nerves, the silence enveloping him like a blanket. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Then, his eyes turned to the lake. It was just beyond the trees, nestled like a mirror between the darkening world and the sky. But there was something odd about it. It was too still. There were no ripples, no waves, nothing that signaled the presence of life. It looked like a vast sheet of glass, reflecting the sky and the trees perfectly, but with an eerie smoothness that made his skin prickle. He tried to push the feeling aside. He'd seen calm lakes before. It wasn't unusual. So, he made himself a small campfire and settled down to enjoy his evening. But the quiet was oppressive. Too quiet. No birds calling, no crickets chirping. The only sound, the crackle of the fire. Then, as the night fell deeper, he heard it. A whisper. It was faint, like the wind was carrying voices. But there was something distinct about it. It was coming from the lake. At first, he thought it was the wind. But no, it was more like words, hushed and distant, too muffled for him to understand. The sound of someone or something whispering just out of reach. He stood up, heart pounding in his chest. His instinct screamed at him to stay away, to ignore it, but the whisper was persistent, calling him. John couldn't explain why, but he found himself drawn toward the water. Slowly, against his better judgment, he grabbed a flashlight and made his way toward the lake. As he reached the water's edge, the whispering grew louder, clearer. It sounded like pleading? No, it was more like an invitation, a welcome. He shone his flashlight across the water. Nothing. The surface of the lake remained perfectly still, unbroken. But the sound, it was growing louder, almost beckoning him. He could feel it now like a magnetic pull, urging him to step closer, to get closer. The air around him grew cold, a sudden chill that sank into his bones, and yet he couldn't pull himself away. He took a step closer to the water, then another, until his boots were submerged, the water cold against his legs. Still, the surface remained perfectly calm, the whispers wrapping around him like a noose. He stepped in deeper. It was when the water reached his knees that he realized something was wrong. The whispering was no longer soft. It was insistent, sharp, like voices in agony, now screaming for him to come closer. His mind screamed for him to turn around, to run back to camp. But his feet wouldn't move. They were stuck in place, as if the very water was holding him, pulling him deeper into its still, smooth surface. He looked down. Beneath the glassy surface of the lake, the water wasn't as it should be. There were shapes, dark figures, moving slowly in the depths. They weren't fish, weren't anything natural. And then he saw it, a hand, long, pale, and clawed, reaching up from the depths, scraping along the underside of the water. His heart skipped a beat, but he couldn't look away. He tried to pull his foot back, but the water held him. The hand wasn't alone. There were more, dozens of them, rising from the lake like hungry shadows. Their faces began to form in the glassy surface, sullen, hollow eyes staring up at him. A voice, clearer than before, crooned from the depths of the water. Join us. Come closer. Come home. John's legs trembled, but still he couldn't move. He had to get out of there. But the lake, it was a trap, and the longer he stayed, the more it held him. The water began to rise higher, inching up his body, crawling toward his waist, his chest. He was drowning, but not from the water. The lake itself was suffocating him, closing in on him from all sides. He opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Only the sound of the whispering voices filled his mind, a chorus of hollow, beckoning calls. The water had taken him, consumed him, and now would feed on him like it had fed on so many before him. As his vision blurred, he saw the last thing he would ever see, the reflection of the lake, of the trees, of the sky. But it was no longer his own. It was the face of someone who had been here before, someone lost to the lake, their body now part of it, swallowed by its hunger. The lake had claimed another soul. The next morning, when a park ranger arrived to check on John's camp, there was nothing left. The tent, his belongings, even his flashlight, everything was gone. The lake remained undisturbed, calm, as if it had never known the presence of a man who had come to it seeking peace. But the whispers were still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the next lonely soul to come too close. Story 10. The Flesh of the Earth. The Jensen family had been looking forward to their weekend getaway. They needed a break from the city, and the remote forest offered the kind of peace they craved. It was a beautiful place, a stretch of trees untouched by civilization, where the birds sang at dawn and the air was thick with the scent of pine. The kind of place that felt like it belonged to another world. They set up camp in a clearing at the heart of the forest. The kids, Lily, Matt, and little Ellie, ran around collecting firewood, their laughter ringing through the trees. Mark and Sarah, their parents, made sure the tents were secure and the campfire pit was ready. Everything seemed perfect, idyllic even. It felt like the beginning of the best trip they'd ever had. That was before they saw the tree. It was just there, in the center of the clearing, looming over them like a twisted guardian of the forest. Its bark was gnarled, dark with age, and thick roots twisted out from the base, spreading across the earth like snakes. The tree looked ancient, older than anything they'd seen before, and somehow wrong. It wasn't the kind of tree you saw in picture books. It had a presence, something sinister, as if it were waiting. Mark, always the curious one, walked up to it. He placed his hand on the rough bark. It felt alive, warm against his palm. He pulled his hand away quickly, but the sensation lingered, crawling up his arm like an insect. "That's odd," he muttered to Sarah. "It feels alive, doesn't it?" Sarah frowned. "It's just a tree, Mark." But it wasn't just a tree. As night fell, the forest grew darker, and the temperature dropped sharply. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above them. The family gathered around the campfire, huddling close for warmth. The flames crackled, sending shadows dancing on the trees. Ellie, the youngest, sat quietly, staring at the old tree in the distance. "Dad," she whispered, tugging at Mark's sleeve. "The tree, it's moving." Mark looked over at the tree. He saw nothing. "It's just the wind, honey." But then the ground beneath them trembled, a low vibration that rumbled through the earth. It started slowly, like the earth was stretching, yawning after a long sleep. The tree groaned, the roots jerking and twitching. And then something horrifying happened. The roots began to stir. They writhed and twisted, slowly at first, but then faster, as though the tree itself had come alive. It was as if the earth was waking, shaking itself free of its long slumber. The roots began to rise from the ground, thick and writhing like serpents, curling and reaching for anything in their path. Mark stood up, his heart racing. "Get back! Everyone back!" But it was too late. The ground beneath them buckled, and the tree's roots reached out, snaking across the earth, pulling everything in their path toward the center of the clearing. Lily screamed, running toward the tents, but the earth was giving way beneath her feet. Matt tried to grab her, but the ground pulled him away from her, the roots tugging at his legs, dragging him backward. "Mom, Dad!" Ellie screamed, her small voice desperate, but the roots were already creeping toward her. Mark tried to reach her, but the ground opened up, swallowing the ground beneath his feet. Sarah ran toward him, but her legs were caught by a thick, twisting root, pulling her down. Her screams echoed in the night, but the earth devoured them. It was as if the forest itself was hungry. The tree groaned again, its roots growing thicker, longer, stretching toward the sky. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though it were feeding on the family's terror, drawing them closer, drawing them down into the earth. "Help! Somebody!" Mark gasped, but his voice was cut off as a root twisted around his body, lifting him from the ground. He looked up in horror as the roots began to drag him toward the tree. The earth seemed to close in, suffocating him, pulling him into the soil like a prisoner in a grave. The ground around the tree was shifting. It wasn't just the roots, it was the earth itself, moving like something alive, something ancient. The tree was feeding, and now it had a taste for flesh. Sarah's face went pale as she tried to fight against the relentless grip of the roots. "We have to get out. We have to." But there was no escape. In the end, the earth consumed them all, their screams swallowed by the forest. The tree had grown hungry over the years, and now it had its meal. As dawn approached, the clearing was still, quiet once again. The only sign of the family's presence the twisted remains of the tree, its roots now more vast, more powerful than before. And deep beneath the earth, the tree's hunger had not been satisfied. It waited for its next victim, patiently biding its time until the next family came to camp beneath its twisted branches. The earth was always hungry, and it never forgot.